and that sort of thing, to pair their offerings with the needs and the situation of many of their students.
I've read a couple of comparisons to for-profit state community colleges, but it's my understanding that community colleges are still much less than most for-profit schools.
To the taxpayer or to the student?
To the student.
Right.
And when you're looking, I mean, I totally agree that students need, community colleges do fill up, as you said, they need an alternative. But when minorities and lower income students are being targeted to community schools that just cost so much money and the dropout rate is just so high, I mean, how do you address that?
Well, when you look at the community colleges, first of all, I think there's a couple factors that are happening right now. We're talking over the last couple of years. One of them is because so many states are in a budget downturn and they're looking to cut anywhere, they're cutting in community colleges. So the lack of classroom space that already existed at community colleges has now gotten worse. And secondly, a lot of the people who do go to trade schools maybe weren't ideal students in high school. Maybe got off on the wrong track through whatever. And that's an issue. And I do think if you want an apples and apples comparison in terms of society, you have to look at, you know, when you say, well, gee, it costs so much more for the trade school, that's because they're not subsidized by the taxpayer. And if they were subsidized by the taxpayer, they'd probably charge the same rates as community colleges, but they're not. And as I say, they actually pay taxes. I don't know of any community college pays taxes.
From the student's perspective.
Right.
You're
Well,
taking these under these lower income, like I said,
right.
lower students, and then they don't graduate, and they have like $10,000 in debt after 6 months.
Right. Well, I mean, what are their options even before that? If you said you could, here's sort of what I think is the law of unintended consequences. Say this reg, either in its proposed form or even current form, goes into effect. What are the admissions office of the proprietary schools going to do? They know that if their default rate goes above a certain number, none of their students can get federal aid. So what are they going to do? They're going to look at the admissions submittals, and they're going to say, oh, this kid has one rich parent, or one middle class parent, or this kid has a spouse who works. And they're going to consciously, or maybe not so consciously, say, whatever we do, we can't take as much of a chance on a student, because if we lose the federal aid, then we might as well sell the building or whatever. And so the law of unintended consequences is, if you do that, essentially the lower rung of the ladder for the students who really financially need the aid is going to be sawed off. And that's an issue. And again, I come back to, if you're losing a lot of money because these are federal loans, and I'm fiscal conservative, I'm for looking at everything and make sure it has all kinds of protections. And I can think of a dozen protections off the top of my head in terms of tightening up how the admissions are done and what the process is and 100 other different things. But if you just say, if you do this to the schools, none of your students can get financial aid, I find it hard to believe human nature isn't such that they will then stop taking risks on students who otherwise might have a chance. The other argument, and I've talked to people, I was a vice president of a school for a number of years, and I've taught not a for-profit, a non-profit, very non-profit. And what a lot of people do with trade schools is different than if you're going to get a liberal arts degree or something like that. They want to go and they want to learn how to do electrical skills or plumbing or hairdressing or whatever it is. And some of them are going because they've already worked in the business, but they need a little more. And they cherry pick. And yeah, they don't finish. They don't get a degree, but they do get training. And the bad schools, between the bad schools and the good schools, I think students can know. You walk in and you have somebody who's not qualified versus somebody who's well qualified. The market actually works when you give it a chance. And unfortunately, this is not the way to use the market to address our educational problem. I agree 100% with Doug. We've got a lot of problems. The cost of education has far exceeded the rate of inflation for decades now. And you go to many, many schools, and they overspend. And even community colleges, a big scandal the LA Times covered about their community school program, where they were erecting a building for construction trades, and the building was crumbling. They had plumbing that didn't work. They had all kinds of scams, kickbacks, people who were cronies with the powers that be for the community college. So community colleges, now, if your argument is that the students who graduate from community college at least don't have big debts, that's very true, but it's not free. I mean, society pays.
From what you're saying is that you're offering essentially the most poorest student one of the highest, the most costly, not only option is very, very costly.
Well,
and granted, that's a chance, but.
Well, what's the option? Then just say, okay, all schools free. I mean, they do that in parts of Europe, and it's not a pretty sight. They do that in parts of you can get your 4-year undergraduate, you can be a permanent student till you're 30-something years old, etc. I'm not sure that's the answer either. I think there can be finer distinctions, though, that are being made.
Are there...
So you talked a lot about Steve Eisman's role in the process,
right,
and it being problematic. And it seems to me that people testify before Congress and are involved in regulations that have a financial stake in the outcome all the time.
Right.
And if we listened to Steve Eisman 5 years ago, I mean, he was right about the mortgage crisis, and
right,
maybe the default rates wouldn't be so high. So I guess I'm just confused why it's such a problem that he was involved.
Here's why it's a problem.
Situations aren't.
Here's why it's a problem. He's been called in to give educational policy advice. He knows almost nothing about it, except that he's got a gigantic bet. He called it, I never thought in my lifetime I'd have another chance to score as big as I did on the mortgage security thing. When you read, I don't know if you're like Michael Lewis, I kind of like his books, Liar's Poker and these others. He wrote a book about Steve Eisman called The Big Short. And it's, like all of his books, it's very entertaining. Eisman has a persona. He's, as his wife says, he's not rude as a tactic, he's sincerely rude. And he's a very brusque guy, and he's very bright. He knows an opportunity when he sees it, when a lot of other people don't see it. The difference between that and, say, you're going into some steel export regulation and the steel makers show up and the people who are the consumers show up, is it's right there on their sleeve. They know the field. Their best interest is what's in the best interest of their constituencies. In the case of Steve Eisman, I would say there's no real sign he cares about education one way or another. He's never done anything in education before. He has no expertise. He sees it as, and the clincher was his statement that, of course, this investment doesn't work unless the government goes along. Well, by the government going along, it means draconian regulations that basically cut off students from loans for schools that don't meet the metric. And if he had his way, the metric would be set far differently than it currently is. So that's the difference. The other thing I would have done if I were sitting on that committee is I would have asked him and saying, the House and the Senate have different rules of testifying. And in the House, they've had a rule now for a few years, going back to, I think when the Republicans controlled it after Gingrich, that if you have certain financial stakes, like if you get a grant from the government, you have to disclose it, and so forth. And I know when I've testified to the House and the Senate, House, you've got to do this, you have to sign it, you're getting grants. And the Senate, not so much. And what I would have liked to have seen would have been questions from Harkin saying, well, look, first of all, why was the guy even called in? But because there's got to be 1,000 people in the country that know education policy 100 times better than him. But secondly, which stocks are you shorting? That's what I'd ask.
Wasn't the first question Senator Harkin asked him, do you have a financial stake?
Yeah, and he said, yeah, I have a financial stake, and then they quickly went on to the rest of it. That was it. Do you have a financial stake? I have a financial stake. I'd like to know which ones he was shorting, frankly, because that's what the stake is. I don't think he would have told because, you know, that there's some proprietary reasons why you don't want to have that. But here's the question I have is does he have a real stake in education policy, or is his stake purely financial and absolutely nothing else? Is it the good of the country? Is it the good of the students? Is it the good of education? Or is it, boy, I could have a payday just like when I called the mortgage crisis? And sorry for being jaded, but I happen to think it's the